Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, security in Asia as the foreign ministers meeting of the Conference on Interaction and Confidence Building Measures in Asia today in Beijing. President Xi has firm words on both the tensions on the Korean Peninsula and the South China Sea issue. And the value of education. A quarter of the world's billionaires are college dropouts, begging the question, are traditional education modes really worth today's sky-high tuition rates? And we begin today's show with the security issues in Asia. Foreign ministers and diplomats are meeting in Beijing for the 5th Conference on Interaction and Confidence Building Measures in Asia, or CICA. Chinese President Xi Jinping addressed the meeting and gave a speech on the development of the security issue in Asia, as well as the challenges that lie ahead. Asia's security issues are of international concern. How can these issues be resolved in a peaceful way? Before we go to our discussion, let's take a look at some of the background first.
Promoting sustainable security. As 26 regional leaders gathered in Beijing in pursuit of a steady and peaceful Asia, Chinese President Xi Jinping voiced thoughts on reaching that goal.
We have to stick to dialogue and negotiation in accordance with international law to resolve disputes peacefully. Use dialogue to add trust, solve disputes, and promote security.
As nations become increasingly interconnected, security in Asia plays a vital role in maintaining global stability. Tensions on the Korean Peninsula have become a hot-button topic, drawing attention not only in Asia but also around the world. President Xi said that China has spared no efforts to push relevant parties to talk and negotiate with each other.
We stick to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, stick to the peace and stability of the Korean Peninsula, as well as solve problems through dialogue and negotiation. As one of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, China has been fully implementing relevant resolutions passed by the United Nations. As a close neighbor of the Korean Peninsula, we will never allow war and turmoil.
In recent years, tensions in the South China Sea have also roused global attention. The involved parties each have their own claims and have acknowledged that they may be unlikely to resolve differences in the foreseeable future. But through direct and peaceful negotiations, the disputes are surmountable.
I want to stress that China has always been advocating to maintain the peace and stability of South China Sea. We also firmly protect our sovereignty and other rights in the area. China also sticks to peaceful ways and negotiating directly with relevant parties to resolve disputes. And we are willing to join ASEAN countries to build a peaceful, friendly, and cooperative South China Sea.
Founded in 1992, CICA is a very young organization with a different nature from other security mechanisms commonly dominated by big powers. CICA has the characteristics of an Asian initiative which values equality among members and is led by small countries. As security issues in the region pose risks to stability, CICA's mission is ever more important.
For more on the foreign ministers' CICA minister meeting, we are joined in our Beijing studio by Mr. Teng Jianchun, who is director of the Center for Arms Control at the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir, to our program. Meanwhile, joining us from Tehran, we're having Professor Mohammad Murandi, professor and also dean of the World Faculty Studies at the University of Tehran. Welcome, sir. Meanwhile, joining us from Moscow, we're having Mr. Dmitry Trenin, who is the director of the Carnegie Moscow Center. He also been with the center since its inception and chairs the Research Council and the Foreign and Security Policy Program. Welcome as well, Mr. Trenin. So, gentlemen, we understand the 3 countries that you are originally at least coming from are in fact the members of CICA, China, Iran, and also Russia. But at this moment, during this conference of the foreign ministers, we see some really urgent issues, not necessarily only about the organization's development, but really what's going on right now in Asia. DPRK is the one attract everybody's attention. On the day of the CICA ministerial conference, the news came out. Another Musudan missile was launched, even though it failed, according to international observers. But Mr. Teng, how urgent really is the situation on the Korean Peninsula? We understand there's a party congress coming over.
Yeah, I think the CICA's conference at this moment is very crucial for the countries concerned to discuss the issues like DPRK. And after the 2270 resolution adopted by the UN Security Council, the situation in Korean Peninsula has been in a very serious condition. I think the two sides, I mean DPRK and the United States, continue their effort to increase to intensify the tension in that region. I think this is actually a real threat for the security and the peace and stability of Asia continent. So
we heard the Chinese minister talking about this at the press conference. We also heard at the speech given by the Chinese President Xi Jinping, he talking about, here's the exact quote, absolutely not permit war or chaos on the Korean Peninsula as Korea's neighbors. But what can China do, really?
Actually, China contributed greatly for the denuclearization in DPRK and also in ROK deployed by the United States, the nuclear weapons. So I think this time China's cooperation with the other countries in UN Security Council and also in the regional countries, I think is of great importance for the future to maintain the momentum to curb the nuclear and the missile capability in DPRK.
And of course, among the CICA members, there's Russia, who is a UN Security Council P5, as they say, permanent 5. And also, Russia has been on the six-party talks, dealing with DPRK as well on different fronts. Mr. Trenning, how much role can Russia play in this regard if we all identify it as a big threat?
Well, Russia is a close neighbor of Korea. It shares a border with Korea, just like China does. If something happens on the Korean Peninsula, a military conflict, a test that has gone awry, or some incident, Russia would feel the result of that. So Russia has a very high stake, I would say as much as China, in seeing to it that the Korean Peninsula does not become a battlefield of a new war or does not become an area of another disaster on the scale of Chernobyl or worse. So Russia is both a member of the currently suspended talks on the Korean nuclear issue. Russia is a country that maintains relations with both Pyongyang and Seoul. Russia has a close partnership relationship with China, and Russia shares a fairly serious interest in stemming proliferation of and reversing proliferation of nuclear weapons with the United States.
All right.
So Russia has a very significant role to play in the situation on the nuclear issue of the Korean Peninsula.
Very interesting, sir. You describe Russia's role in so many different ways. But let me ask you, because at this year's CICA meeting, there has been specific results in the declaration, 2 sentences in the declaration, fully implementation of the UN Security Council resolution on the Korean Peninsula nuclear crisis issue. And the other thing is strengthen cooperation among member countries of CICA on this front as well. But many wonder whether Russia was or is going to have any kinds of cooperation, military or technological wise, with DPRK. From your perspective?
Well, Russia stopped being a military ally of North Korea at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The new Russia immediately redefined its former relationship with the DPRK. Russia has a political relationship with North Korea. It has an economic relationship much smaller than, for example, China has, but it certainly keeps channels of communication to the north open. Now, Russia wants to use whatever influence it has to impress the North Korean leadership that its actions are reckless and dangerous, that those actions will not lead to any good results for North Korea, that those results leave North Korea essentially friendless in the world, and that those actions need to stop. On the other hand, if North Korea were to adopt a different kind of policy, and Russia was in the past proposing ideas such as a trans-Korean pipeline, a trans-Korean railroad.
Right.
In case North Korea accepted those proposals, situation on the Korean Peninsula would have been so much better, would have been improved, and North Korea would be able to profit not by blackmailing others, but by transiting goods and transiting passengers to common benefit.
Very interesting. We've already got two perspectives coming from China, coming from Russia. Both, of course, are members of CICA. Another member of CICA is Iran. We have Professor Morandi with us. Professor, we've been talking about Iran's nuclear issue for a long time with you on many occasions. But of course, an agreement was reached, P5+1 with Iran. And I was talking to your first Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Vice Minister Mr. Sahradi, and he was telling me that maybe inspirations could be drawn for the resolution of the DPRK nuclear issue, let's just say coming from the Iran nuclear issue and its way out to resolve it. Of course, there are many differences, but Professor Morandi, from your perspective, what can be learned and what can be shared?
Well, I would say that it is very different, as you pointed out, because in the case of Iran, the country has always been developing its nuclear program within the framework of international law. And the Iranian peaceful nuclear program, in the opinion of Tehran, was used as an excuse to put pressure on the country by the United States because Iran did not abide by American policy in the region, such as in Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and so on with regards to Palestine. Nevertheless, despite the enormous differences, what the Iranians have proposed is for concession of flexibility on all sides. And I think the Iranians did show a significant amount of flexibility, even though there were complaints at home that maybe Iran had gone too far. But Iran went the extra mile to show that it was not the side that was causing the trouble. In the case of the Korean Peninsula, I think it's far more complicated, because on the one hand, as your previous guest rightly pointed out, the behavior of the North Korean government has been erratic and unconstructive. But on the other hand, the United States has not shown any willingness to improve the situation. In fact, I think one of the benefits of the Chinese and the Russian policy is that they've been trying to manage the situation. China, for example, and Russia both have very good relations with South Korea, but they also have relations with North Korea. The United States, on the other hand, I think, has an interest in keeping the conflict between the two Koreans as it is, because that will legitimize their presence in South Korea.
Yes, indeed.
Again, I don't want to exaggerate, but it's not completely unlike what we see in the South China Sea, where it is in the interest of the United States to create difficulties between China and its neighbors in order to justify its presence there.
Well, there are different interpretations as to why countries do things this way or that way, even on this very specific issue. Let me come back to the three of you about what exactly can CICA play in this regard, because there's a UN Security Council, there is also the kinds of six-party talks, even though it's been suspended so far, but there has been various kinds of a G20 foreign minister meeting, a G7 as well, all talking about this. So what can an organization like CICA, pretty young, I have to say, Mr. Tang, and also really coming from Asian countries, from very different walks of life, and also Eurasian countries such as Russia. What can be done about this? What can be the role of another layer of organization like CICA?
Yeah, CICA was established immediately after the end of Cold War, and all the member states now, 26 member states, 9 observers, and 4 international organizations. I think this is a very specific targeted at the regional affairs, not only the security in Asia, but also the development and the effort to promote the peace and the stability in this region. You mentioned just now the diversity of the region, for example, different regions, religions, and also different cultures, different peoples. Of course, they should have an inclusive approach to each other. This is actually a diversified continent, and which will give you a different development, and also give you a different benefit for the country, for the peoples. So I think if we have a look at the continent, of course, we should have such a significant and specific mechanism to deal with the regional issues, affairs.
Right. And of course, when it comes to regional issues such as controversial as the DPRK nuclear issue, this mechanism seems to be quite interesting and useful in bringing everybody online in a way to face the same challenge. Talking about CICA, China has held the presidency of CICA since the year 2014. During the past 2 years, the nation has been making a lot of efforts to implement the mechanism. Take a look at this. Last May, the first annual conference of CICA non-governmental forum was held. In August, we saw the first conference of CICA Youth Council. In early October, a series of activities were seen on CICA Day. In November, there was the first conference of CICA Business Council, and then this April, the Dialogue of Asian Civilization held in Boao Forum in Hainan. All of this related to CICA, but what can be the role of CICA is still a big question mark, Mr. Trenning, because we have already quite a number of competing or cooperative, if we want to use that adjective, mechanism already existing in Asia and beyond Asia.
Well, they may be competing, but they're also complementary. I think that CICA has an advantage of being a very wide forum. It includes 26 nations of the Asian continent, and this is one of the widest groupings in that part of the world. It's not an alliance, it's not a bloc, it's not an economic union, but it's a forum. It's a forum where people from different parts of Asia come and discuss things that matter to them all. And this creates, I think, a culture in Asia of discussing jointly, multilaterally, the issues pertaining to security and other important areas common to all the continent. I think what CICA does is essentially build a society, an international society in Asia. And that, I think, is a very useful initiative. There are other organizations, you're right, there's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There are other organizations and members, some members of CICA are also members of the G20, etc. But CICA is important as a very wide forum to discuss issues of interaction, of cooperation, and that, I think, contributes, as I said, to the evolution and the emergence, eventually, of an Asian international society.
Right. Professor Morandi, we've seen Asian countries over the years quite eager as its economy rises to seek for an identity. Of course, at this moment, it's quite complex because we have got territorial disputes, we got the DPRK nuclear crisis, but putting all of these things aside, this region, including the Middle East and Eurasian countries, have to move forward. Will a forum like this really be of much help, particularly a forum in which China is holding the presidency? we certainly have noticed, Professor Morandi, before you answered the question, that there is a difference between APEC, for example, which is Asia Pacific, across the Pacific countries, this time CICA, which is mainly Middle East, Eurasian, and Asian countries ourselves.
I think it's very important.
As I said,
Professor,
it's complementary.
Yes, yes, indeed. Professor Morandi, if you can.
There's somebody
yes.
else, right?
Thank you so much. Yes.
Okay, absolutely.
Yes, I agreed. I agree with what your previous guest was saying, and I think that the organization itself comes at a very important moment, and that is as the world is changing and the balance of power, economic power, is moving away from North America and Western Europe, and until now, much of the fate of the world, politically speaking, has been determined by Western countries, and we are moving away from a Eurocentric world. And therefore, a forum like this, in addition to economic organizations such as the AIIB and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, all of these complement one another, and they allow Asian countries to move closer towards one another and to gain better understanding, because traditionally our understanding of one another has come from the West, from Western think tanks, from Western texts for university students, but now this opens a greater opportunity for greater understanding, and also importantly greater cooperation. For example, the situation in Afghanistan, which is of great concern to Iran, to India, to Central Asia, to China, to Russia, can be discussed in such forums. We have the rise of the drug trade, we have the rise of ISIL in Afghanistan, which is becoming potentially a threat to Central Asia. These are all issues that need to be discussed in such broad forums, and we need more local cooperation rather than Western cooperation to deal with these issues.
Dr. Teng, before we go, it's very interesting, Professor Morandi, talking about we need to see each other into the eyes directly rather than through a third person or a third party. Which brings us to the end of the question, which is, we see this time CICA in the declaration talking about, you know, drug trafficking, anti-drug trafficking. It's also talking about encouraging small and medium-sized enterprises. All of these are very different agendas from one another, but under one umbrella of anti-terrorism. Do you see CICA will be a pillar in terms of fighting terrorism in the future?
Of course, as Dimitri just mentioned, this is a very important forum, not an airline or not a bloc. So I think the situation in Asia continent also suffering the terrorist challenges. So I think such a security forum should contribute greatly to the anti-terrorist effort by the countries concerned in this region.
We're looking forward to seeing more discussions among CICA members, and we'll see what might come out of it. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Teng Jianchun in Beijing, Mohammed Morandi in Tehran, and Dmitry Trenin in Moscow. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us. Thank you. Stay with us here on World Insight. We got our final segment coming right up. A quarter of the world's billionaires are college dropouts as tuition rates skyrocket. Is the traditional education model still worth it? That's the question. This is World Insight, and welcome back. Are billionaires exceptionally good at taking exams as well as in handling their finances? Or are they more likely to have escaped school at the first opportunity and work their way up to make their fortunes? For at least a quarter of the world's billionaires, it would seem to be the latter. In recent years, more and more people are questioning the path of a traditional education. We'll be discussing the value of a college education tonight, but first, this.
The world's top self-made billionaires do not just have more money than everyone else. They often have less top-level education than the managers and accountants running their companies. Research shows that about a quarter of the world's wealthiest entrepreneurs dropped out of university or high school before going on to join the financial elite, a greater proportion than those who achieved master's degrees. Although we're most familiar with famous college dropouts and household names like Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates and Facebook co-founder Mark Zuckerberg, there seem to be a significant number of billionaires who followed the same path, something legions of MBA students may ponder as they rack up large debts in pursuit of a ticket to future riches. Concerns about the effect of rising tuition fees has led some to question the value of a university education for those wanting to start a business at a young age. Peter Thiel, the billionaire venture capitalist and co-founder of PayPal, has created a scholarship that encourages students to skip university to free them up to take risks early. His foundation promises grants of $100,000 to young people who want to build new things instead of sitting in a classroom. But Kathy Harvey, the Associate Dean of the MBA program at the University of Oxford, believes a university education is invaluable in most cases. She says that education isn't just about making money, it's about being resilient in life. In China, many parents see higher degrees as vital to having a better future, but in recent years, more and more graduates have faced difficulties in finding jobs in the market. Maybe it's worth asking whether a traditional education is the only way to success.
To answer that question, I'm joined here in the Beijing studio by Ms. Wang Yan, who is the director of the Department for International Exchange at the National Institute for Educational Science. Welcome to our program, ma'am. And also joining us from Hong Kong, we're having Dr. Li Jun from Education Policy Unit at the University of Hong Kong and past president of the Comparative Education Society of Hong Kong. Meanwhile, joining us from the United States, we're having Professor Da-Li Yang join us from Chicago. He teaches in the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Welcome to our program, the three of you. First of all, do we really still need a college education? After all, we see that about a quarter of the world's billionaires, supposed to be the most successful people, drop out of school rather than finished their college education. Professor Yang, maybe we should start with you.
Well, I think number one, colleges and universities are a vital force for society, both in helping the young men and women grow up, becoming adults, productive citizens. But in fact, universities play a fundamental role in research and various ways of applications of that research. There are various studies that do show that returns on education, especially higher education, are very high in the United States and across the world, in fact, in developed economies. So in that sense, there is a very strong argument for the average men and women that it's important to get a college education and perhaps even higher. But at the same time, when you mention that quite a few of the billionaires actually have not received a college education, that speaks also to the possibilities that the college education is not the only route to success, in fact. But overall, though, when you think about a quarter of the billionaires do not have a college education, that means 75%, three-quarters of them do, actually. And those that don't, actually, so sort of very often also have received a very good high school education. They have been nurtured to venture out, to strike out on their own, and very often they have gone to college and then dropped out, and so on.
Well, probably they have lost hope about the college education. Whether or not, let me go to you, Mr. Li in Hong Kong. The question is not necessarily about college education, but what kinds of college education? Is the kinds of college education we are having now outdated? Is it still be able to prepare the students, quote unquote, as Professor Yang mentioned earlier, he specifically used the word prepare. Is that preparation still updated? Mr. D. Mr. Li?
Good evening, Tian Wei. Thank you for your question. I think, first of all, we need to clarify a false observation from just a few billionaires who succeeded and quit from their college education. For example, in my hand, there is a recent study conducted by a British compare insurance company. The chart shows here actually among the top 100 billionaires, on average, almost it's more than half of them have attended college education.
Right.
While you compare that number with the general population in the U.S. 2013, you can see much smaller numbers of the population attended college education. And also for those who quit out from the university education, you can see for the top 100 billionaires, the dropout rate actually is much small. It's around 14%.
Okay. So what are you trying
that
to
means
say, sir?
14 of them.
All those numbers are beautiful. What are you
well,
trying to suggest?
Well, I'm trying to clarify that might be a false observation that it seems that college education has no use to make billionaires. And the second thing I want to clarify is that college education is the necessary condition for individuals to succeed in the society, but not a sufficient condition. So these billionaires who quit from college education, they may make it up with other factors, finally succeed in their own businesses.
Ms. Wang here in Beijing, these days we've been talking a lot about entrepreneurship in China, innovation as well. Many believe the so-called traditional education has not been the inspiration for creating neither of this. So what is going on, therefore, with our educational system is a big question mark. Are we really making talents, or are we really making masses? That is the question here. So, Ms. Wang, from your perspective, doing educational research in China for decades, what is your answer?
Well, I think our education system is producing talents, but the definition of talents required by the labor markets are changing. And in today's world, we have higher and higher demands on people's not only the cognitive skills, but also the social and emotional learning skills, and also their abilities to update their knowledge and skills very quickly. So that's why actually the entrepreneurship education has become a catchword in today's education reform. And the one big move is the first is to inject more vocational education element into the regular education system on track. The second is now we are turning into a whole batch of a large group of the university and college into, we call them University of Applied Science, or these are basically tertiary vocational universities.
Well, Professor Yang, if China is having a big question mark, what about the United States? Because many in China and in developing countries look at the U.S. education, believing it is better, at least, in creating talents. But certainly we see many of the billionaires we talked about who drop out from university are actually from the United States. Not to mention many of the other billionaires try to create funds to attract young people. Just quit your college education, come out and do your own project. That's really going to educate you for a whole life. So, Professor Yang, what do we need now? Do we need a professor standing there on the podium preaching us with knowledge and probably the way of thinking? Or should we just have the young people going out into the society, hit the walls, let them learn the lesson, be a tough cookie, as they say, in that way to educate themselves? Professor Yang.
Well, you really asked some of the toughest questions.
Thank you, sir.
In fact, the kind of debate that you just articulated really go back in the Chinese case, of course, goes back to the 19th century. In fact, China has struggled in many ways in its quest for modernity. And of course, you remember that in 1905, the Qing dynasty actually finally abolished the civil service exams because of the need to adapt to a modern world, to introduce science and technology. And in many ways, actually, we continue to be confronting the same questions, except in different guises within China. In the U.S. case, I think there's no doubt the university sector is extraordinarily important. It's a vital part of American society and economy. Many of the fundamental achievements in science and technology were produced by universities. But as for individuals, however, they not only are functioning in universities, but also they go into an American society that has been very tolerant of failures, of experiments, tinkerers in many ways, and at the same time, also that there has been a culture for fostering innovation, whether it's Silicon Valley or elsewhere now in many parts, including in Chicago. So in that sense, I think actually what we have is an ecology that accepts people who are willing to experiment. But at the same time, when you mention, however, even in the top most creative companies, when the CEO perhaps may not have a college education, a formal college education. Very often they assisted, they work with people who do, who know the technical skills, who can write the codes, who can formulate the new drugs and so on. So in that sense, it depends on the industry. It depends on the where actually you're trying to make sort of the new creative solutions. Universities are not always successful in teaching creativity, but it's this entire ecology, including universities, companies, and so on, that do create. And it's, in that sense, actually, we need all sorts of people, visionaries, the Elon Musks of the world who think outside of this world in many ways. But at the same time, we need a lot of people who create the technical details as well.
But Professor, let me just follow up by asking you, and I expect a simple answer from you as well. Can the role of university change if university are not really turning out the top level talents? Then can university switch its role? I mean, universities can still exist, but the role of university is rather not only an educational institution, but more of an incubator for big talents, incubator for the top of the cream. Can we see that happening in the near future? Professor Yang, very briefly.
Absolutely. That has been the case throughout history. You look at the American universities, for example, in the old days, they were pretty much seminaries, missionary enterprises designed to teach the next generation priests, to produce the priests, and so on. But over time, especially towards the end of the 19th century, the American university system began to undergo a major change and transformation, led by universities such as the University of Chicago, Johns Hopkins, and Rice, and so on. So in that process, it unleashed changes, and of course, American universities both cooperated and have both cooperated and competed against each other. So as a result, American universities have become much more research-oriented over time. Today, in fact, including at the University of Chicago, we actually have the Chicago Innovation Exchange. And in fact, it's designed to foster innovation. Universities also have offices to help their professors to, for example, to license the technologies, their new findings, to companies and so on. So increasingly, universities are also not just actually educating, but also they are creating and also working with industry, partnering with them.
Well,
yes,
we have seen the role of some university been evolving so far, but the overall educational system is still a big question mark, not only here in China, but also elsewhere. That is one thing why people talk about this debate, whether university education is still very useful and efficient. The other reason is because of the pretty much high university tuition, the hiked up tuition fees of recent years has also fueled the debate that we talk about. In Western countries, the inflation of tuition fees has become a social problem. For example, in the UK, the country itself, a decade ago, local students enjoyed free college education if they chose to pursue the option. But now, tuition fees has hiked up so much that they are paying as much as overseas students who used to pay nearly 3 times as much compared to their local classmates. As a result, we've seen student protests even in that country. And this pushback is happening in the US as well. One of the reasons Bernie Sanders has won so many young people's heart seems has a lot to do with his proposals about the college education and the tuition fees. Putting those things aside, what reason do you think, Ms. Wang, is the existence of universities? Should there be money-making machines? Should there be a top or a ceiling as to how much the tuition can go? Can university students can still afford at all anymore a college education, a good one?
Well, the university or education is generally perceived as the public good, and it's not a commercial product. But it really depends on what kinds of university you are referred to. If they are public universities that offers the mass education,
right,
and then there should be the ceiling or should be the threshold for the charging of the tuitions and fees. But if it's private university and that is basically market oriented, and then I don't think there is any problem if they charge high tuition fees. I think the baseline is to ensure that the students who are talented can go to
right,
or obtain a good university education with the support, financial aid from the governments, including the scholarships, student loans, or subsidies, etc.
Well, Mr. Lee, we only have 30 seconds left. I know it's a very hard situation to answer any question, but the thing is, we've seen universities used to be affordable and now ever more difficult. So the question is, when everybody can feed themselves and want to look for better higher education, should there be a top for the tuition? Final words from you.
It's a very interesting question indeed. But I think I would not suggest youth to quit from college, and of course they should take advantage of college university to further develop their career. In China, due to the Confucian heritage, which views education is very, very important. And China is a credential society. And everybody values that, and if you don't have that, that will be a big problem. And in the future, for the career development, that will be a big problem.
And we're running out of time. I know the education about debate will continue forever. For that, we're coming to the end of today's program. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. On behalf of the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again tomorrow for more World Insights on CCTV News. Bye for now.